In this lesson, we're going to create the tests for both the user registration and user login. However, there's something that I've noticed by reading some documentation that we need to change or update really quickly, which is the project is using the database's PostgreSQL extras, and it's supposed to not be doing that. It's supposed to be using async PG, because otherwise I think the connection is not all the way through asynchronous. So we're going to add async PG as the extras here. We're also going to update the database's version to the latest at this time, which is 0.61. And we're going to go ahead and save that. And now let's install that using Poetry Update. We are now ready to do another change, which is on the database's PY. We're going to need to have async PG driver as well in the connection string. So we only need to add this async PG keyword on the Postgres and save the file. Now, you might remember that we have also this PostgreSQL connection in Pytest right here. We're not going to use async PG here because it's not really necessary to connect asynchronous. We're going to just use async PG for the main connection like string here. So for the test as well as for Alembic INI, which also has the connection string, we're going to leave it as PostgreSQL, which will use psychopg2 binary. So with that out of the way, as you remember, we based this project on the counter application. So we have the tests infrastructure there already. So if you go to the tests folder, you're going to see a conf test there that sets up the databases. I drop the database after all the tests run, create the tables that we need, and I think, create the test tab and the test client. So this we can leave as is. Now, of course, we want to update the test counter because that's not what we're going to do. We're going to test the login and registration. So this is not going to be test counter, it's going to be test user. So let's go ahead and rename that. And we're going to say from user models, import user table here. And I'm going to delete this for now. I just want to see that everything works correctly. So if I'm going to say /login and do assert. I think we display user login on the login template. So I'm just going to assert that comes up. Oh, just login. So I'm going to say assert that login is in the string of the body. So I'm going to go ahead and test that these changes that we did are working correctly and also update our Docker images. From the terminal, I'm going to do docker compose up build. Okay, so it looks like it's running now. Let's go check and see that the login is working. So we go to the login page. And we're going to use our previous user that we have registered. And that worked. So that means that the database async PG change that we did works perfectly fine. So we're going to go ahead and continue with the testing. So go ahead and stop the Docker Compose, but make sure that you have the Postgres instance running. Okay, so we're going to now do the first test, and the first test is going to be creating the user or registering the user. But for that, we need to add something to conf test because we're not creating the databases here. We're just creating the test tab and the test client. So we're going to create another fixture that's going to be called create all, which will be using the SQL Alchemy create all module. Okay, so we define this as a fixture. Since we don't have any asynchronous operations, we're going to define it as def and not async def create all. And it depends on the createDB previous fixture on the same conf test. Then we're going to create an engine using the createDB DB URI. that we define on CreateDB. And we're gonna do this sort of like boilerplate operation, which is we're gonna assign the metadata that we have on the dbpy metadata. That is just the meta information of all the models. And we're gonna bind that metadata to the engine that we're creating in line 82. So that then we can call this method called createAll, which will essentially just create all the models as tables within the database. So save the file. At this point, I want to see if I can run. We have already the test initial response, and we have the conf test. I want to see that things are running. So there's two ways to do this. I've added on the VS Code a launch JSON to run the tests using Pytest. So what this does is, if you're running VS Code, you can use this Flask like icon called testing, and you'll see that you have like tests in there. And the nice thing about this, it discovers all the tests, and you can also put breakpoints, different lines in here, and it'll stop in there. And you can also run the test from this little like icon. If you're not using VS Code and you just want to, go old school using the terminal, you can just run Pytest. But make sure that you have the Poetry shell enabled. For that, you do Poetry shell. Or you can also, if you're not on the shell, let's say that we want to exit from there. This is where you would be normally be. You do Poetry run Pytest, and that it's the same thing. You can do either way. So I'm going to do the Poetry shell, and then just do Pytest, just because it's shorter, and we can run it from there. And let's see what happens. Amazing. So that worked. The tests are passing, so it's getting the login response here. And just to show you how that breakpoint thing works on VS Code, if we run this test, just do debug instead of run. Run will run it, but debug will stop on the point. And see, it stops there. We can then go to the debug console and examine the contents of the different things. So for example, body, we see that it has all the HTML in there. Yeah, you can debug anything that you need. So that's a nice thing. So with that in place, let's start working on the actual registration test on the next lesson.